It was March of 2005. A black SUV wound slowly down a familiar road in the Santa Ynez Valley of California. Inside sat a man who had once been called the King of Pop, the greatest entertainer the world had ever seen. His face, now gaunt and tired, pressed against the tinted window as he watched the iron gates of his beloved estate grow smaller in the rearview mirror. Michael Jackson was leaving Neverland Ranch. He would never truly return. For nearly 2 decades, this sprawling 3,000-acre property had been his sanctuary, his playground, his escape from a world that never quite understood him. Here, among the Ferris wheels and the exotic animals, the candy shops and the movie theaters, he had built something that existed nowhere else on Earth. A place where childhood never had to end. A place named after the magical island in Peter Pan, where boys never grew up and dreams could live forever. But on this day, as the accusations mounted and the cameras circled like vultures outside those famous golden gates, the dream had become a nightmare. The magic kingdom that Michael Jackson had poured over $30 million into creating was about to begin its slow, painful transformation into something else entirely. A ghost town, a monument to broken innocence, a cautionary tale about the price of fame, the weight of childhood trauma, and the impossible pursuit of happiness through fantasy. To understand why this ranch meant so much to one man, and why its abandonment broke something inside him that could never be repaired, we must go back. Back to the beginning. Back to a small house in Gary, Indiana, where a little boy with enormous eyes first learned that childhood could be stolen. And once stolen, it could haunt you forever. The house at 2300 Jackson Street in Gary, Indiana was small, cramped, and filled with dreams. It was 1958, the year Michael Joseph Jackson came into the world, the 7th of 9 children born to Joseph and Catherine Jackson. The neighborhood was working class, the streets lined with modest homes and factories that belched smoke into the gray Midwestern sky. Joseph Jackson worked at a steel mill during the day and played guitar in a rhythm and blues band at night. He was a man of fierce ambition and even fiercer discipline. Catherine was gentle and devout, a Jehovah's Witness who sang hymns while she cleaned and cooked for her enormous family. The house itself was barely more than 1,000 square feet. Children slept 3 and 4 to a bed. Privacy was a luxury no one could afford. In this tiny space, young Michael shared not just a room, but a bed with his brothers Tito, Jermaine, Jackie, and Marlon. The walls were thin, the quarters were tight, and the sound of music, whether from the radio, from Joseph's guitar, or from the children's own voices, filled every corner. From the moment Michael could walk, it was clear he was different. He moved to music instinctively, his small body responding to rhythm with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. While other toddlers stumbled and fell, Michael glided. His voice, even as a child of 4 or 5, had an emotional depth that startled adults. He could sing songs about heartbreak and loss with such conviction that people wondered how a boy so young could possibly understand such pain. Catherine noticed it first. She would watch her youngest son standing in front of the television, mimicking the moves of James Brown with uncanny accuracy. She would hear him singing along to the radio, his tiny voice finding harmonies that even trained musicians might miss. There was something special about this child, something that set him apart from his siblings, something that both thrilled and frightened her. She knew that talent like this could open doors. She also knew that it could exact a terrible price. Joseph noticed, and Joseph had plans. By the time Michael was 5 years old, His father had organized his sons into a performing group called the Jackson Brothers. Rehearsals were mandatory. Mistakes were not tolerated. Joseph Jackson believed that success required sacrifice, and he was willing to sacrifice his children's comfort, their freedom, and their happiness to achieve it. The rehearsals began early and ended late. Joseph would sit in a chair with a belt across his lap, watching every move, listening to every note. When a dance step was wrong, when a harmony was off, when concentration wavered, the belt would swing. Years later, Michael would describe these sessions in interviews, his voice quiet and distant. He spoke of terror. He spoke of wanting desperately to please his father, and of the crushing shame when he failed. He spoke of nights spent crying into his pillow while his brothers slept, afraid to make a sound. But there was something else Michael spoke of, something that would prove even more significant than the physical discipline. He spoke of never having a childhood. While other children in Gary played baseball in empty lots and rode bicycles down tree-lined streets, Michael was rehearsing. While his classmates attended birthday parties and school dances, Michael was performing at talent shows and amateur nights across the Midwest. By the age of 6, he was the lead singer of what was now called the Jackson 5. By 8, he was a local celebrity. By 10, he was famous. In 1969, when Michael was just 11 years old, the Jackson 5 signed with Motown Records. Their debut single, I Want You Back, shot to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. 3 more #1 hits followed in rapid succession. The Jackson 5 were suddenly the biggest act in America, and little Michael, with his afro and his bell-bottoms and his voice that seemed to contain all the joy and sorrow of the human experience, became the face of the group. The family moved from Gary to Los Angeles. The cramped house on Jackson Street was replaced by a mansion in Encino. The steel mills and gray skies gave way to palm trees and swimming pools, but something had been lost in the transition, something that could never be recovered. The years between 1969 and 1975 were a blur of recording sessions, television appearances, and concert tours. Michael performed on every major variety show of the era. He danced with Diana Ross. He met presidents and celebrities. He sang before crowds of screaming fans who knew every word to every song. He was, by any objective measure, living an extraordinary life. But inside, Michael was drowning. In interviews given decades later, he would describe this period as a kind of imprisonment. He had no friends his own age. He never went to a regular school. He never experienced the simple pleasures that other children took for granted. No playground games, no neighborhood explorations, no lazy summer afternoons spent doing nothing at all. Instead, there were hotel rooms and recording studios and airplanes. There were adults who wanted things from him, who saw him not as a child, but as a product, a source of revenue, a meal ticket. And there was his father, always watching, always judging, always ready with the belt when the performance fell short of perfection. The mansion in Encino had a backyard with a basketball court and a swimming pool. Michael rarely used them. He spent most of his free time in his room, reading, drawing, and dreaming of a different kind of life. He became obsessed with fairy tales, with stories of magical places where children could escape the cruelty of the adult world. He read Peter Pan over and over, transfixed by the idea of a boy who refused to grow up, who lived on an island where imagination was law and childhood lasted forever. As Michael entered his teenage years, the pressures intensified. His voice changed, as all boys' voices do, and suddenly the sweet soprano that had made him famous was gone. The Jackson 5's popularity began to wane. New acts emerged. Tastes shifted. Joseph pushed the boys harder, demanding more rehearsals, more performances, more everything. And Michael, now an adolescent dealing with all the confusion and insecurity that comes with puberty, found himself increasingly isolated. He developed severe acne during these years, a condition that caused him tremendous shame. His brothers teased him mercilessly, calling him cruel nicknames. His father joined in, making comments about his appearance that cut deep into his already fragile self-esteem. Michael began to see himself as ugly, as deformed, as fundamentally flawed. This perception would haunt him for the rest of his life, driving him to undergo surgery after surgery in a desperate attempt to fix what he believed was broken. By the late 1970s, Michael was ready to break free. He left Motown with his brothers and signed with Epic Records. More importantly, he began working on a solo album that would change everything. In 1979, Off the Wall was released, showcasing a mature Michael Jackson who could sing, dance, and write music with equal brilliance. The album sold 20 million copies worldwide. But Michael wasn't satisfied. He was haunted by the fact that Off the Wall had been largely overlooked during awards season, receiving only one Grammy nomination despite its commercial success. He became obsessed with creating something so monumental that it could never be ignored. And in 1982, he achieved exactly that. Thriller was not just an album, it was a cultural earthquake. From its release in November of 1982, it dominated the charts in a way no album had before or has since. 7 of its 9 tracks became top 10 singles. The music videos, particularly the 14-minute short film for the title track, revolutionized the medium and became cultural touchstones that are still referenced today. Thriller sold over 100 million copies worldwide, making it the best-selling album in history. Michael Jackson was no longer just a pop star. He was a phenomenon. He was the king of pop. The Moonwalk, which he debuted on the Motown 25 television special in 1983, became the most imitated dance move in history. His single sequined glove became a fashion statement. His military-style jackets spawned countless imitators. Every gesture, every decision, every word he spoke became news. Children around the world practiced his dance moves in front of bedroom mirrors. Teenagers plastered his posters on their walls. Adults who had never bought a pop album found themselves humming Billie Jean in the shower. Michael Jackson had transcended music to become something larger, a cultural force that touched every corner of society. The Thriller era brought Michael everything he had ever wanted professionally. Unprecedented success, universal acclaim, the respect of his peers. But it also brought something he hadn't anticipated. A level of fame so intense, so all-consuming, that it made normal life impossible. He couldn't go to a grocery store without causing a riot. He couldn't walk down a street without being mobbed. He couldn't have a conversation with a stranger without wondering what they really wanted from him. The world that had once seemed so exciting, so full of possibilities, now felt like a prison. And Michael, the boy who had never had a childhood, began to dream more intensely than ever of escape. It was during this period, in the mid-1980s, that Michael Jackson first laid eyes on the property that would become Neverland Ranch. The land was located in Los Olivos, California, nestled in the rolling hills of the Santa Ynez Valley, about an hour and a half north of Los Angeles. Originally called Sycamore Valley Ranch, it comprised nearly 3,000 acres of oak-studded hillsides, green meadows, and quiet streams. The property had been developed in the 1970s by a businessman named William Bone, who had built a Tudor-style main house and various outbuildings on the land. When Michael first visited in 1987, he was immediately captivated. Here was space, here was privacy, here was beauty untouched by the chaos of fame. The valley felt like another world entirely. A world where the constant noise of celebrity could finally, blessedly, fade away. But Michael saw something more than just an escape. He saw a canvas. Standing on that hillside, looking out over the oak trees and the golden grass, he began to imagine what this place could become. Not just a home, but a world unto itself. A place where childhood could be recaptured. A place where the imagination could run wild. A place where he could finally have all the things that had been denied to him as a boy. The swings he never swung on. The rides he never rode. The games he never played. The carefree joy he never experienced. He saw amusement park rides rising from the meadows. He saw exotic animals roaming the grounds. He saw a movie theater and a candy shop and a train that wound through the property like something from a storybook. He saw, in short, Neverland. In 1988, Michael Jackson purchased the property for $17 million. The renovations began almost immediately, and they were staggering in their scope and ambition. Over the next several years, Michael would pour over $35 million into transforming Sycamore Valley Ranch into his personal fantasy kingdom. The main house, a 13,000-square-foot Tudor revival structure, was extensively remodeled to suit Michael's tastes. The interior became a study in contrasts, mixing antique furniture with whimsical touches that reflected his Peter Pan obsession. Crystal chandeliers hung above rooms filled with arcade games. Priceless paintings shared wall space with framed drawings of Disney characters. The master bedroom, decorated in tones of gold and burgundy, contained both elegant furnishings and a collection of mannequins dressed in elaborate costumes. Throughout the house, images of children at play adorned the walls, paintings and photographs celebrating an innocence that Michael treasured above all else. But the house was just the beginning. What Michael truly wanted was an amusement park, and that is exactly what he built. A custom-designed Ferris wheel rose 80 feet above the valley floor, its gondolas painted in bright primary colors that could be seen from miles away. A carousel imported from Europe spun beneath an ornate canopy, its hand-carved horses gleaming with gold leaf and jeweled bridles. There was a zipper ride and a scrambler, bumper cars and a wave swinger, all maintained to theme park standards and available for riding at any hour of the day or night. A miniature train, modeled after a vintage steam locomotive, wound through the property on over a mile of track, passing through tunnels and over bridges, stopping at stations named after storybook locations. Michael often drove the train himself, wearing an engineer's cap and waving to passengers as if he were conducting the most important railway in the world. The zoo at Neverland was equally ambitious. Michael had always loved animals, seeing in them a purity and innocence that he found increasingly rare in humans. He filled his ranch with exotic creatures from around the globe. There were elephants and giraffes, orangutans and chimpanzees, llamas and zebras, snakes and crocodiles. The most famous resident was Bubbles, a chimpanzee that Michael had adopted in 1985 and treated like a member of the family. Bubbles traveled with Michael, ate at his table, and slept in a crib in his bedroom. To outside observers, this relationship seemed bizarre, even troubling. But to Michael, it made perfect sense. Animals, unlike humans, never betrayed him. They never sold stories to tabloids. They never sued him. They simply loved him, unconditionally, for exactly who he was. A movie theater on the property could seat 50 guests in plush velvet chairs. Here, Michael screened classic films and new releases, often with children from hospitals or underprivileged backgrounds as his guests. A candy shop offered every variety of sweet imaginable, all completely free. There were video game arcades and toy stores, water balloon fights, and slumber parties. In the main house, a secret room hidden behind a bookcase led to a space filled with life-sized figures of fairy tale characters. A private retreat where Michael could disappear into fantasy whenever the real world became too overwhelming. The gardens at Neverland were designed with the same attention to detail as everything else. Acres of flowers bloomed in carefully planned arrangements, their colors changing with the seasons. Fountains sprayed water high into the California sunshine. Statues of children and animals dotted the landscape, frozen in moments of play and wonder. A floral clock, its numerals formed from living plants, kept time in the central plaza. Everywhere you looked, there were signs of imagination at work, of a vision so complete and so specific that it could only have come from one mind. Michael personally supervised much of the landscaping, spending hours with designers discussing the placement of every tree, every flower bed, every decorative element. He wanted the grounds to feel like stepping into a storybook, and he would accept nothing less than perfection. Workers recall him arriving at dawn to inspect the previous day's progress, pointing out adjustments that needed to be made, always pushing for something more magical, more enchanting, more perfectly aligned with the dream in his head. At the entrance to the property stood the famous gates that would become Neverland's most recognizable symbol. Wrought iron and topped with gold leaf, they featured an elaborate design showing children playing on swings and seesaws. Above them hung a sign that read simply Neverland. The letters formed in a whimsical script that seemed lifted from a fairy tale. A uniformed guard stood watch around the clock, checking credentials and turning away the curious. Behind those gates lay a world entirely separate from the one beyond, a world where Michael Jackson could finally be the child he had never been allowed to be. For a time, Neverland was everything Michael had dreamed it would be. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the ranch hummed with activity and joy. Michael held lavish events for celebrities and friends, but he also opened his gates to those who could never have afforded such wonders on their own. Children from hospitals and orphanages were bussed in regularly, their faces lighting up as they encountered the rides and animals and unlimited candy for the first time. Make-A-Wish Foundation made Neverland a regular destination for terminally ill children who would spend magical days riding the carousel, meeting the animals, and playing games with Michael himself. Elizabeth Taylor was a frequent visitor, her friendship with Michael one of the few relationships he trusted completely. She would later describe Neverland as a place of pure joy, a celebration of innocence that she found profoundly moving. Other celebrities came too. Macaulay Culkin and his family spent extended periods at the ranch, the young Home Alone star becoming one of Michael's closest companions. Brooke Shields visited regularly, as did Diana Ross and a parade of other famous faces. But Michael seemed happiest when the guests were children, ordinary kids who had never experienced anything like the wonders he had created. He would spend hours with them, playing video games, having water balloon fights, watching movies, and telling stories. For these children, a day at Neverland was a memory that would last a lifetime. The estate employed a full-time staff of over 50 people during its peak years. There were groundskeepers and animal handlers, security guards and household staff, engineers who maintained the rides, and specialists who cared for the exotic animals. The monthly operating costs ran into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, a sum that Michael paid without complaint. Money, to him, was simply a means to an end. The end was Neverland, and Neverland was priceless. The staff who worked there during the golden years would later speak of Michael with a mixture of affection and bewilderment. He could be extraordinarily generous, giving lavish gifts and bonuses for no particular reason. He could also be demanding, expecting perfection in every detail, and becoming visibly upset when things fell short of his vision. But above all, they remembered his childlike enthusiasm, the way his eyes would light up when something worked exactly as he had imagined, the genuine joy he seemed to feel when children experienced the wonders he had created. For those who worked at Neverland, it was unlike any job they had ever had or would ever have again. Michael's daily routine at the ranch reflected his unique personality and preferences. He typically slept late, having spent the nights in his recording studio working on music or watching films in his theater. Mornings were quiet, reserved for reflection and solitude. In the afternoons, he would often take long walks around the property, communing with his animals and enjoying the beauty he had created. Evenings were for guests, for parties and gatherings that could extend well into the early morning hours. Through it all, Michael remained an enigma even to those closest to him. He could be warm and generous one moment, cold and distant the next. He would disappear for hours without explanation, retreating to secret spaces that even his staff knew better than to enter. The main house at Neverland contained numerous rooms that visitors rarely saw. Michael's personal quarters were strictly off-limits, guarded with an almost obsessive privacy. He had an elaborate alarm system installed that would alert him whenever anyone approached certain areas. He kept detailed records of who came and went, of every phone call made and received. For all the openness and joy that characterized the public spaces of Neverland, there was an equal measure of secrecy and control in its private corners. This duality would later become a source of suspicion and speculation. As questions arose about what exactly went on behind those closed doors. By the early 1990s, Michael Jackson had created something truly unique. There was no other place in the world quite like Neverland Ranch. It was a theme park and a zoo and a personal playground, all rolled into one. It was a monument to childhood and a refuge from adulthood. It was, in the truest sense, a dream made real. But dreams, as Michael would soon discover, can turn into nightmares. And Neverland, the place he had built to escape the pain of his past, was about to become the center of a controversy that would define the rest of his life. The first dark clouds appeared in August of 1993. A 13-year-old boy named Jordan Chandler, who had been a frequent visitor to Neverland and had developed a close relationship with Michael, made an allegation that would shake the entertainment world to its core. Through his father, a dentist named Evan Chandler, the boy accused Michael Jackson of sexual molestation. The accusation came with graphic details and demands for money. Michael denied the allegations vehemently, calling them completely false and a terrible persecution. His lawyers pointed to the fact that Evan Chandler had been recorded on tape discussing plans to ruin Michael and extract money from him. The entertainment industry and the general public were divided, some believing the accusations and others convinced that a wealthy star was being targeted for extortion. The investigation that followed was exhaustive and invasive. Police searched Neverland Ranch from top to bottom, looking for evidence to support the boys' claims. They photographed every room, cataloged every possession, and interviewed everyone who had ever worked at or visited the estate. Michael, who had always treasured his privacy, watched in horror as his sanctuary was violated by strangers. The police demanded that Michael submit to a strip search and photographing of his body, which he described as the most humiliating experience of his life. The images were compared to descriptions allegedly provided by his accuser. No match was confirmed, and no charges were ever filed. In January of 1994, a settlement was reached in the civil case. Michael, against the advice of many, agreed to pay a sum reported to be between $15 and $22 million to the Chandler family. His lawyers argued that the settlement was necessary to end the distraction and allow Michael to focus on his health and career. Criminal investigators were frustrated, as the settlement included provisions that complicated their ability to compel testimony. The case was eventually closed without charges, but in the court of public opinion, the damage was done. For many people, the very existence of a settlement suggested guilt. Why would an innocent man pay millions of dollars to make accusations go away? The question would haunt Michael for the rest of his life. Neverland was never quite the same after 1993. The investigations had exposed the ranch to a level of scrutiny it had never faced before. Every aspect of Michael's unusual lifestyle, from his sleepovers with children to his peculiar habits and obsessions, had been dissected and debated in the media. The ranch that had once seemed magical now seemed suspicious to many observers. The very features that Michael had designed to celebrate childhood, the amusement park rides, the candy shop, the arcade games, were reinterpreted as sinister lures designed to attract young victims. The narrative of Neverland shifted from fairy tale to cautionary tale, and it would never fully shift back. Michael responded to the crisis in characteristic fashion. He retreated deeper into himself, trusting fewer people, building higher walls. He married Lisa Marie Presley, the daughter of Elvis, in May of 1994, a union that many viewed with skepticism given its timing. The marriage lasted less than 2 years. He then married Debbie Rowe, a dermatology nurse, who would bear him 2 children, Michael Jr. and Paris. That marriage also ended in divorce. Throughout these tumultuous personal changes, Neverland remained his home, his anchor, his place of refuge. But the joy that had once filled its grounds had been permanently diminished. The ranch still functioned, the rides still turned, the animals still roamed, but something essential had been lost. In the years that followed the 1993 scandal, Michael Jackson attempted to rebuild both his reputation and his relationship with Neverland Ranch. He continued to invite children to the property, though now under much more stringent supervision and with detailed documentation of every visit. He maintained that his love for children was pure and innocent, a manifestation of the childhood he had never been allowed to experience. He pointed to the countless terminally ill children who had found joy at Neverland, the families who had written letters of gratitude, the lives that had been touched by his generosity, but the shadow of suspicion never fully lifted. Every interaction with a child was now viewed through a lens of doubt. Every act of kindness was questioned. The very thing that had given Michael's life meaning, his connection with childhood innocence, had become a source of endless controversy. The ranch itself continued to operate during these years, though with notable changes. Security was tightened considerably. Visitors were more carefully screened. The open-door policy that had once characterized Neverland gave way to a more controlled environment. Michael still hosted events for sick children and charitable organizations, but these occasions were now carefully managed affairs with legal oversight and documentation. The spontaneity and joy that had once defined life at the ranch was increasingly replaced by caution and procedure. The staff noticed the change in Michael too. He spent more time alone in his quarters. He was more guarded in his interactions. The man who had built a fantasy kingdom to recapture childhood innocence now seemed burdened by the very dreams he had created. Financially, Neverland was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The monthly expenses, which included not just staff salaries and animal care, but also mortgage payments, insurance, and utilities, exceeded several $100,000. Michael's income, while still substantial, was not what it had been during the Thriller years. His subsequent albums, while successful by normal standards, had not matched the unprecedented commercial performance of his earlier work. Bad had sold 30 million copies. Dangerous sold 32 million. These were extraordinary numbers by any measure, but they paled in comparison to Thriller's 100 million plus. And Michael's spending habits, always extravagant, showed no signs of moderation. He continued to collect art and antiques, often paying premium prices for items that caught his fancy. He maintained multiple properties in addition to Neverland. He traveled with large entourages that required extensive accommodations. His legal fees, which had skyrocketed during the 1993 investigation, remained substantial as various parties continued to pursue claims against him. By the late 1990s, financial experts were warning that Michael's spending was unsustainable. He had borrowed heavily against his assets, including his share of the lucrative Beatles catalog he had purchased in 1985. Neverland, once a symbol of unlimited possibility, was becoming a financial burden that Michael could not easily bear. In 1998, a series of events occurred that would further darken the atmosphere at Neverland. Several former employees filed lawsuits alleging wrongful termination, claiming they had been fired for refusing to cover up inappropriate behavior. The lawsuits were eventually settled or dismissed, but they generated additional negative publicity and raised new questions about what actually went on at the ranch. Security guards who had worked at Neverland gave interviews describing an atmosphere of secrecy and control. They spoke of alarm systems designed to warn Michael when anyone approached certain areas. They described his unusual sleeping habits and his close relationships with young boys. Whether these accounts were accurate or motivated by financial considerations was impossible to determine. But they added to the growing perception that Neverland concealed dark secrets behind its fairy tale facade. Michael's behavior during this period grew increasingly erratic. He had developed a dependency on prescription medications, a problem that had begun years earlier following a scalp injury sustained during a Pepsi commercial filming. The pain from that injury, combined with the stress of his legal troubles and the demands of his career, had led him to rely more and more heavily on painkillers and sedatives. Those close to him watched with concern as he became more isolated, more paranoid, more unpredictable. The ranch that had been designed as a place of joy was becoming, for Michael, a place of escape from realities he could not face. In 2003, the final chapter of Neverland's story as Michael Jackson's home began to unfold. In February of that year, a British journalist named Martin Bashir aired a documentary called Living with Michael Jackson that had been filmed over the course of 8 months. The program included extensive footage shot at Neverland, showing Michael's elaborate lifestyle, his collection of mannequins and art, his relationships with children who visited the ranch. One segment in particular would prove catastrophic. Michael was shown holding hands with a 13-year-old cancer survivor named Gavin Arvizo, discussing how they had shared his bedroom during the boys' visits. Michael defended the practice as innocent and loving, saying there was nothing sexual about it. He argued that sharing his bed with children was the most loving thing he could do, a way of providing the nurturing experience that many of these kids lacked in their own lives. The documentary sparked immediate outrage. Child welfare authorities opened an investigation. The Santa Barbara County District Attorney's Office, which had been frustrated in its attempts to prosecute Michael a decade earlier, saw an opportunity to build a case. Within months, Gavin Arvizo and his family were making accusations of molestation against Michael Jackson. The charges were more specific and detailed than those from 1993. Michael, they claimed, had plied the boy with alcohol, shown him pornography, and engaged in sexual acts over a period of several months. In November of 2003, nearly 70 police officers descended on Neverland Ranch with search warrants. They spent hours going through the property, removing boxes of evidence, photographing every room, interviewing staff members. The search was broadcast live on television, with helicopters hovering overhead capturing aerial footage of the grounds. For Michael, who had already endured one such violation of his sanctuary, the experience was devastating. He watched from afar as his private world was once again exposed to public scrutiny. On December 18, 2003, Michael Jackson was formally charged with 7 counts of child molestation and 2 counts of administering an intoxicating agent to a minor. He turned himself in to authorities, posting $3 million bail. The trial that followed, which began in January of 2005 and stretched over 4 months, became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in American history. Every detail of Michael's life at Neverland was examined under oath. Former employees testified about the alarm systems, the sleepovers, the access to alcohol. The prosecution painted a picture of a predator who had used his fantasy kingdom as a trap for vulnerable children. Michael's defense team countered with a portrait of an innocent man targeted by a family with a history of making false accusations for financial gain. They presented evidence that the Arvizo family had previously accused a security guard at a department store of inappropriate behavior, receiving a settlement in that case. They argued that the family had approached Michael specifically because of his wealth and fame. Day after day, the world watched as witnesses took the stand. There were tearful testimonies and heated cross-examinations. There were moments of confusion and moments of clarity. The media circus outside the courthouse grew more intense with each passing week. Fans held vigils, praying for Michael's acquittal. Critics demanded justice for the alleged victim. The whole world, it seemed, had an opinion about what had happened inside those walls at Neverland. And Michael, who had spent his life performing before audiences of millions, now sat silently in a courtroom, his fate in the hands of 12 strangers who would decide whether his dream had been innocent or criminal. The trial featured testimony from some of Michael's closest friends and associates. Macaulay Culkin took the stand and denied that Michael had ever behaved inappropriately with him during their years of friendship. Other former child visitors to Neverland echoed this denial. The defense presented these witnesses as evidence that Michael's relationships with children, while unconventional, were genuinely innocent. But the prosecution had witnesses of its own, including former household staff who described seeing disturbing behavior and an atmosphere of secrecy that suggested concealment. Throughout the trial, Neverland remained at the center of the narrative. Photographs of the ranch were entered into evidence. Descriptions of its layout, its amenities, its security systems were presented in exhaustive detail. The jury even visited the property, walking through the same rooms where Michael had entertained his young guests. For those who had once seen Neverland as a place of magic, the clinical dissection of its features during the trial transformed it into something else entirely. Every carousel horse, every candy jar, Every video game console became potential evidence in a criminal case. The fantasy was being systematically dismantled, replaced by a darker interpretation that made everything Michael had built seem sinister. On June 13, 2005, the verdict was announced. Not guilty on all counts. Michael Jackson was acquitted of every charge brought against him. Outside the courthouse, his supporters celebrated with tears and cheers. Inside, Michael himself seemed drained rather than elated. The ordeal had taken an enormous toll on his health, his finances, and his spirit. He had won the legal battle, but he had lost something perhaps more important. He had lost his relationship with Neverland. In the weeks following the verdict, Michael Jackson left Neverland Ranch and never returned to live there. The property that he had spent nearly 2 decades building and maintaining, the sanctuary he had created to recapture his stolen childhood, had become irrevocably associated with the darkest accusations imaginable. He could not walk through those gates without being reminded of the police searches, the testimony, the endless speculation about what had happened within those walls. The magic was gone, replaced by memories too painful to revisit. He relocated to Bahrain as a guest of a sheikh, then moved on to Ireland, France, and various locations in the United States. He was a nomad now, a man without a home, drifting from one temporary residence to another while the place he had built with such love and care sat empty. The decline of Neverland Ranch after Michael's departure was swift and sad. Without his presence and his financial resources, the estate began to deteriorate. The staff was reduced, then reduced again, until only a skeleton crew remained to maintain basic security and prevent complete collapse. The amusement park rides, once so carefully maintained, fell into disrepair. The Ferris wheel stopped turning. The carousel horses grew dusty and faded. The bumper cars sat motionless in their arena, their bright paint peeling in the California sun. The animals were gradually rehomed to zoos and sanctuaries around the country. The elephants and giraffes, the chimpanzees and orangutans were loaded onto trucks and transported away, leaving empty enclosures and silent habitats behind. Even Bubbles, Michael's beloved chimpanzee companion, had been moved years earlier when he grew too large and aggressive to safely remain in close contact with humans. The zoo that had once delighted thousands of visitors became a collection of empty cages and overgrown pathways. Inside the main house, dust accumulated on surfaces that had once gleamed. The arcade games went dark. The movie theater projector fell silent. The candy shop jars, once filled with every conceivable sweet, stood empty on their shelves. The elaborate alarm systems still functioned, but there was little left to protect. Photographers with telephoto lenses captured images of the deterioration, which were published in tabloids and websites around the world. Neverland, the magical kingdom, was becoming a ghost town. The swimming pools that had once sparkled with crystal clear water grew cloudy and green with algae. The tennis courts cracked and weeds pushed through the surface. The elaborate playgrounds rusted in the coastal air, their swings hanging motionless, their slides dulled by years of neglect. Nature began to reclaim what Michael had so carefully constructed. Vines crept up the walls of outbuildings. Trees dropped branches onto once manicured lawns. The Santa Ynez Valley, which had witnessed the creation of something magical, now watched silently as that magic slowly faded away. Financial troubles accelerated the decline. Michael had fallen behind on the mortgage payments, owing millions of dollars to the lending institution that held the note on the property. In 2008, he faced foreclosure, with the lender threatening to auction off Neverland to recover its investment. At the last minute, a refinancing deal was arranged through Colony Capital, an investment firm, that allowed Michael to retain ownership of the property while restructuring the debt. But the terms of the deal gave Colony significant control over the estate's future, and Michael's emotional connection to Neverland continued to fade. He showed no interest in returning or restoring the property. It had become, in his mind, a place of pain rather than joy. On June 25, 2009, Michael Jackson died at his rented mansion in Los Angeles. The cause was acute propofol and benzodiazepine intoxication, the result of a lethal dose of anesthetics administered by his personal physician, Conrad Murray, who was later convicted of involuntary manslaughter. Michael was 50 years old. He had been in the midst of preparing for a comeback concert series in London, hoping to rebuild his career and his finances with 50 sold-out shows at the O2 Arena. The concerts never happened. The king of pop was gone. The news spread around the world within minutes. Television networks interrupted their programming. Radio stations played his music continuously. Fans gathered spontaneously at locations associated with his life: the Apollo Theater in Harlem, his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, and of course, the gates of Neverland Ranch, where mourners left flowers, candles, and handwritten notes expressing their grief. For millions of people, it felt like losing a member of their own family, someone who had provided the soundtrack to their lives, whose music had accompanied their first dances, their graduations, their weddings. Michael Jackson was dead, and with him died any hope that Neverland might one day come back to life. The death of Michael Jackson left Neverland Ranch in a state of uncertainty. The property remained under the joint control of Michael's estate and Colony Capital, its future undetermined. There were discussions about turning it into a museum or tourist attraction, a Graceland for Michael Jackson fans. There were proposals for housing developments or wineries, more profitable uses for the valuable land. Nothing was decided, and Neverland continued to sit largely empty, a monument to a dream that had ended in tragedy. In the years following Michael's death, occasional visitors to the area reported seeing the ranch from nearby roads. The famous gates still stood, now rusted and showing their age. The main house could be glimpsed through the trees, its Tudor Revival architecture looking increasingly out of place among the agricultural properties that surrounded it. Local residents spoke of the quiet that had descended over the valley, a contrast to the years when helicopters regularly circled overhead and tour buses parked along the roads, hoping for a glimpse of the famous resident. The staff members who had once worked at Neverland scattered to other jobs and other lives. Some wrote memoirs or gave interviews, sharing their memories of what it had been like during the golden years. They spoke of Michael's kindness, his eccentricities, his genuine love for the children who visited. They also spoke of his pain, his loneliness, his desperate need for connection and acceptance. The picture that emerged was complex and contradictory, as befitted a man who had lived one of the most unusual lives in modern history. In 2015, the name Neverland Ranch was officially changed to Sycamore Valley Ranch, a return to the property's original designation. The name change was reportedly at Michael's request before his death, a final severing of the emotional ties between himself and the place he had created. The estate was put up for sale with an asking price of $100 million, later reduced to $67 million when no buyers materialized. The listing emphasized the property's natural beauty and development potential while downplaying its famous history. Real estate agents gave tours to prospective buyers, walking them through grounds that still bore the marks of Michael's tenure, despite efforts at normalization. In 2020, The ranch finally sold to businessman Ron Burkle, a billionaire investor who had been a friend of Michael Jackson's. The sale price was reported to be $22 million, a fraction of what Michael had invested in the property and far below its previous asking prices. Burkle stated that he purchased the ranch because of his connection to Michael and his desire to see the property preserved and respected. He made no announcements about future plans, leaving the ultimate fate of Neverland uncertain. Today, Sycamore Valley Ranch, formerly Neverland, remains in private hands, closed to the public and inaccessible to the millions of Michael Jackson fans who might wish to visit. The amusement park rides have been removed, dismantled, and presumably sold or scrapped. The zoo enclosures stand empty. The train tracks that once carried Michael and his guests through the property have been torn up. The floral clock no longer keeps time. The candy shop has been stripped bare. The only visitors now are the occasional maintenance workers and the wildlife that has reclaimed much of the property. Deer graze on lawns that were once perfectly manicured. Hawks circle overhead where once helicopters full of paparazzi had hovered. The silence is profound, broken only by the wind through the oak trees and the distant sound of traffic on the valley roads. Those who remember Neverland in its glory days say the contrast is almost unbearable, like visiting the grave of a beloved friend. What remains is a beautiful piece of California land, rolling hills dotted with oak trees, the same landscape that first captured Michael's imagination more than 3 decades ago. The house still stands, though its interior has been substantially modified from the eccentric arrangement Michael maintained. The gates with their images of playing children still mark the entrance, though the sign that once proclaimed Neverland has been removed. The legacy of Neverland Ranch extends far beyond the physical property itself. It represents something larger about Michael Jackson's life, and about the culture that both celebrated and destroyed him. Here was a man of extraordinary talent, perhaps the greatest entertainer of his generation, who used his wealth to build a monument to the childhood he never had. He created a place where children could experience joy, where imagination was given physical form, where the wonders of a theme park were available to anyone lucky enough to pass through those golden gates. Yet that same creation became the focus of the darkest accusations imaginable, transforming from sanctuary to crime scene in the public imagination. The questions that surround Neverland may never be fully answered. Was it truly a place of innocence? A generous gift from a damaged man who wanted only to share the happiness he had been denied? Or was it something more sinister, a carefully designed trap created by a predator who used his fame and his fantasy kingdom to gain access to vulnerable children? The criminal justice system provided one answer with its acquittal in 2005. But in the court of public opinion, the verdict remains divided. Some see Michael Jackson as a victim of persecution, a gentle soul destroyed by a cynical media and by opportunists who sought to exploit his wealth. Others see him as a guilty man who escaped justice through the power of his celebrity and his expensive lawyers. The truth, if there is a single truth to be found, likely lies somewhere in the complicated middle, in the gray areas between innocent and guilty, damaged and dangerous. What is certain is that Neverland Ranch was the most personal expression of who Michael Jackson was and what he believed. It was born from the pain of his childhood, from years of abuse and exploitation and stolen innocence. It was created with genuine love and an earnest desire to bring joy to others, particularly to children who faced challenges and sorrows of their own. It became a burden when the very activities that gave Michael purpose, his relationships with children, became the basis for accusations that would define the final 2 decades of his life. And it was abandoned when the weight of those associations became too great for even the king of pop to bear. The story of Neverland Ranch is ultimately a story about the impossibility of recapturing the past. Michael Jackson spent his entire adult life trying to recreate the childhood he never had, building an elaborate fantasy world where he could be the child he was never allowed to be. But you cannot go back. You cannot undo the damage of the past by constructing amusement parks and collecting toys. You cannot heal your wounds by creating a magical kingdom where childhood lasts forever. The Peter Pan dream, the dream of never growing up, was always just that, a dream. And when Michael finally did grow old, when his body gave out under the strain of medications and exhaustion and a lifetime of trauma, the dream ended with him. Standing on the hills above the Santa Ynez Valley today, looking down at the property that was once Neverland Ranch, you can still sense something of what Michael Jackson saw when he first visited all those years ago. The land is beautiful, peaceful, a world apart from the chaos of Los Angeles and the pressures of fame. The oak trees still spread their branches toward the sky. The streams still run clear through the meadows. The sun still sets in spectacular colors over the distant mountains. But the magic is gone. The Ferris wheel no longer turns. The carousel horses no longer spin. The children no longer laugh and play and eat free candy, while Michael Jackson watches with a smile on his face. What remains is a lesson, though what that lesson means depends on who is interpreting it. For some, Neverland's story is a warning about the dangers of fame, about how the intense scrutiny of celebrity can twist even the purest intentions into something suspicious. For others, it is a cautionary tale about the damage that unaddressed childhood trauma can inflict across a lifetime, how the wounds we suffer as children can shape every decision we make as adults. For still others, it represents the fundamental complexity of human nature, the way that good and bad can coexist in the same person, the same place, the same story. Michael Jackson created Neverland Ranch to build a place where he could finally be happy, where the pain of his past could be transformed into the joy of an endless present. He succeeded for a time. There were years, perhaps a decade, when the ranch functioned exactly as he had dreamed. Children laughed on the rides, animals roamed the grounds, music played and movies screened, and birthday parties unfolded beneath the California sun. Those who were there during those golden years speak of it with genuine wonder, describing a place unlike anywhere else on earth, a place where a man who had everything except a childhood tried to share that missing piece with as many people as he could. But Neverland was always built on a fragile foundation. It depended on Michael's finances, which proved unstable. It depended on public perception, which proved volatile. Most importantly, it depended on Michael's ability to maintain his grip on the fantasy he had created, and that grip eventually slipped away. The accusations shattered something essential in the relationship between Michael and his creation. The trials exposed the ranch to a scrutiny that transformed its meaning forever, and the death of its creator left it without purpose, without energy, without the animating spirit that had brought it to life. The abandoned Neverland Ranch stands today as one of the most poignant monuments in American cultural history. It is a physical manifestation of dreams that could not be sustained, of innocence that could not be protected, of a past that could not be recaptured no matter how much money or imagination was applied to the task. The golden gates that once welcomed visitors to a fairy tale kingdom now guard an empty estate. The train that once carried guests through tunnels and over bridges now exists only in photographs and memories. The man who built it all, who invested his heart and his fortune in creating a place where childhood never had to end, is gone. But stories, unlike their tellers, can live forever. And the story of Neverland Ranch, with all its complexity and contradiction, with all its joy and sorrow, with all its magic and its darkness, will continue to be told as long as people remember the name Michael Jackson. It will be debated and interpreted and reimagined by generations who never knew him, who never walked through those gates, who never saw the carousel spinning or heard the train whistle blowing or watched the sun set over the Santa Ynez Valley while the king of pop smiled at the world he had made. In the end, perhaps that is the true legacy of Neverland Ranch. Not the rides or the animals or the architecture, but the questions it forces us to ask. Questions about childhood and what it means. Questions about fame and what it costs. Questions about innocence and how it can be lost. Questions about redemption and whether it can ever truly be found. These questions have no easy answers. They sit with us, uncomfortable and unresolved, just like the empty estate in the California hills. And that discomfort, that inability to wrap the story up in a neat conclusion, may be the most honest thing we can say about Neverland, about Michael Jackson, and about our own complicated relationship with the dreams we chase and the ones we leave behind. The gates of Neverland are closed now. The fantasy kingdom has fallen silent. The boy who never grew up has grown old and passed away. But somewhere, in the memories of those who were there, in the music that still plays on radios around the world, in the complicated legacy of an extraordinary and troubled man, the dream of Neverland lives on. It lives in the questions we ask about childhood and fame, about innocence and guilt, about the things we build and the things we leave behind. It lives in our continued fascination with a place that promised magic and delivered mystery. And it lives in the eternal human hope that somewhere, somehow, there exists a place where childhood never has to end. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Neverland's story is how perfectly it mirrors the life of its creator. Both began with such promise, such joy, such seemingly unlimited potential. Both were built on a foundation of pain and longing. Both achieved heights that seemed impossible, creating moments of genuine magic that touched millions of lives. And both, in the end, fell victim to forces beyond their control, leaving behind only questions, memories, and the fading echoes of laughter that once filled the air. That place, of course, exists only in stories. And perhaps that is where Neverland belongs now. Not as a physical location that can be visited or photographed, but as a story that we tell and retell, each time finding new meanings, new questions, new insights into the human condition. Michael Jackson built Neverland Ranch to escape from reality. In the end, it has become something more enduring than reality. It has become a legend,